So we are literally going to take this in turns, and so we're so well in tune, we actually managed to wear the same dress today. So we're here in our Project 13 uniform. Completely unplanned. So a lot of, in terms of what I'm going to cover first of all, I'm going to give a bit of a strategic overview. I will be completely upfront and say I'm not a contract expert, so when it comes to the Q&A, please direct those to Emma. What I do is a lot of industry analysis, strategic level, and I've had 15 years as a client. So I will be presenting the first half of the presentation to cover off the work of the infrastructure client group, why they're behind Project 13, and why they are interested in sponsoring it and leading it. So I'll cover off the sort of strategic level intent and what they are committing to change as part of this initiative, and then I shall hand over to Emma, who will cover in a little bit more detail what it actually means in terms of contracts and in terms of some of the things that you might be more familiar with in your day-to-day lives. Okay. So, just a little bit about the infrastructure client group, and this is, I think, quite an important point because to me this is what's different about Project 13. Actually, we've got sponsorship from this for this initiative from the infrastructure client group. So we've got 19 public, private and regulated sector clients behind this. They're not all going to be first in line to adopt it, and then we'll touch a little bit on that later on. But essentially, we've got support and expertise and best practice that we can bring out of each of these organisations to try to create real momentum and real sort of ambition behind the change that we're looking at. They don't just do Project 13, and I shall get it on the table now. It's called Project 13 because it's the 13th thing that they have done. So they did 12 before. They're not very imaginative with their marketing. So just in terms of the Project 13 story so far, unsurprisingly, and again, a lot of this has been touched on already by other presenters, so I won't dwell on the challenges, but they, the infrastructure client group knew there were challenges, sort of systemic challenges in the relationships they had in commissioning, delivering and operating their infrastructure. They knew that it wasn't just a case of blaming the industry, and actually there was something that they needed to look at. So what they did in 2015 was pull together an Infrastructure and Projects Authority, an ICG joint workshop, bringing in some of the suppliers and really had a proper look at what they thought was going on out of any kind of commercial situation so that some of that tension was taken out of the room. From that, they decided to develop this as an initiative, and it's been going from a sort of research phase, working with UCL for some of the studies, some of the more broader evidence base that we needed to draw on to develop the original report. That came out in 2017, which was just making the case for exactly what it was that we needed to change, and now we're into the implementation phase. Okay, so in terms of the problems or the challenges that came out of that workshop, again, none of them were hugely surprising to any of you, I'm sure. A lot of them have already been touched on this morning, but specifically the things that they thought they could do something about as infrastructure clients in terms of changing the way they set themselves up, the frameworks that they created, how they interacted with the industry. They thought they could do something around productivity. They thought actually, although they, it could be painted that you push that onto the construction industry or the construction sector as an external, there was a lot that they could do in their behaviours in terms of how they contracted, at what level they contracted, and how they set themselves up to engage with the suppliers that would mean that you would be able to enable much better productivity by the construction industry. They also recognised quite early on, and I think this was something which was, well, I don't know if it was particularly insightful, but they did recognise even at that stage that it was unsustainable to continue with the current model. They could see that what was happening with particularly their tier one contractors, and the margins that they were reporting there, that it was unsustainable. So they knew at some point they were going to have to change. The model was going to have to change, or something was going to break. And as we've seen and heard, the failure of Carillion has started to indicate and really put a lot more momentum behind this as an initiative, because they can start to see cracks in it now. So they saw it as a challenge, but this really puts a sort of time velocity on the risk of it failing now with Carillion having failed. And then finally, they could also see the sort of on the horizon, the ambitions around digital transformation. And essentially, they had all of these as sort of long-term challenges, things they knew they needed to solve, things that they wanted to embrace. But what they really couldn't see as a collective group was how they needed to change, what they needed to put in place to bring all of this together in a sort of coherent way that they could actually make a difference themselves. So it was all quite disparate, it was all quite visionary. So what Project 13 is started out doing, and it's not there yet, absolutely, but what it has started to do has been to put a bit of meat on the bones of, what is the the new sort of blueprint for the future of the relationship between infrastructure clients and industry that would actually mean that you could get to some of these and solve some of these problems. Okay, so here it is, also known as the dancing man, which we didn't realise until we published it. There we go. You're going to be able to not see it now. Now I've seen it. So essentially what we've mapped out here is a little bit of a sort of schematic. So this is schematic. It's not necessarily an organisational structure, but it's about showing that, you know, the current relationships are very transactional. You know, it's a very, very long, unintegrated, tiered system. When you look to, you know, invest in your infrastructure, that's the sort of relationship you will end up with, because that is how you ask for it as a client. That is how all of the government departments and the non-government departments are set up with their investors, and that's how the supply chain is set up to respond. So if you look at the far left, you can see the long-tiered system. The asset owner is actually quite a way removed from the people who are going to be delivering on their behalf, even potentially designing what it is that they will ultimately end up with. And then in the new system, it's a lot more collaborative, and it's a lot more about working in partnership. So it was great to hear some of Ian's work earlier on, which is already sort of way ahead of what we're looking at and completely aligned to it. So the main differences here is you've got the owner moving from somebody who perhaps during the, particularly the creation of new infrastructure, might be out on a limb and have quite a few steps in the chain before they get to those who are going to be implementing the change, to being really central. And one of the things that we're looking at is how the asset owning organisations can develop that capability. So we've seen great developments recently in project delivery capability, particularly on the government side with the things like the Major Projects Leadership Academy. That's great stuff, but if you don't have that balance of capability with the asset owners, actually you'll have them delivering fantastic on time, in budget, brilliant things that probably don't do what the owner wants and won't give the ultimate long-term performance. So the focus here is really on bringing the owner to the centre and upskilling them to be able to lead this so that we get long-term performance, and try to shift that focus and that demonstration of value from lowest capital cost during the procurement phase. So it's quite a big fundamental change. Has taken quite a lot of debate. You'll also see there that there are more suppliers, more externals who are having a direct relationship with the owner. Again, I think that's an interesting point, because what you're seeking to do there, and I'll come back to it again a little bit later on, but how you select those particular organisations who would come and work in this integrated alliance is based on the impact they'll have on the outcome. So actually you might have something which is quite a small tech SME who could do something fantastic in terms of your long-term performance of your asset, and they would be, you know, core to the sort of centre of the alliance, rather than historically they might have been brought in at a lower point in the food chain. So it starts to really open up a whole different level of debate and really unlock, you can see, you know, from a digital transformation point of view, how this sort of a structure might really enable those better conversations earlier on in the project life cycle. Okay. So this is just a high level. If you had to put Project 13 on one page, you know, what's going to be different? What is it that we are seeking to change, particularly from a client perspective? This is the shift. You know, there's been an awful lot more need for them to take a bit of customer focus, particularly if you see in the regulated sectors. So I don't know if many of you have seen the sort of ongoing debate with Ofwat, who are looking at, you know, who have been very public in coming out about the water companies not focusing enough on their customers. I think it's the same to be said for being able to demonstrate in any sector long-term asset performance is actually understanding what your customers need, representing that as an asset owner and putting that at the centre of what you do. I've already touched on improved productivity, but again, you can imagine if you are having a more collaborative partnership approach, and there are some underlying commercial principles which I'll come to in a second, but all of that sort of thing will help create improved productivity, because you're going to have a better relationship with your supply chain. You're going to be able to incentivise them and engage with the right people who can make the difference in terms of productivity, rather than those you might have just been used to dealing with, because that's how you've set yourself up. That's how the market is configured at the moment. And then finally, it's looking at that sort of fair and sustainable industry. Again, it's been touched on by other speakers, so I won't dwell on it. But I think it's really important that the infrastructure client group recognise that is critical to their success. It's not just about them changing it, and perhaps it's not just about them looking at squeezing the capital costs down and the impact that might have on margins. It's about them taking a step back and saying, what do we need to be sustainable, and actually ultimately have longer term value realised from our investments. Okay. So In terms of some of the things that we've started to develop in Project 13, so Emma all talked about the practical side, but what I would say to everybody in this room is that this is an ongoing development. So what we've done so far is pull an awful lot of expertise. So we've had about 400 individuals, about 200 organisations involved in Project 13, and that's on both sides, so that's clients and people from industry, bringing their expertise and their best practice. We've created an awful lot of, I guess, pooled knowledge that we've put out on the Project 13 website. And one of the things that we try to collate it under is these 3 stages of maturity. So we've really distilled that down into, actually, if you want to work in a more collaborative way, how do you define that? What would be different? And what are some of the pillars under which you would need to change? So if you look on the Project 13 website, which we will share with you at the end of this, you've actually got a maturity matrix. I know everybody loves a maturity matrix, but essentially it just is meant as a guide to start to help you understand some of the big fundamental differences. So you can look at that and say, actually, in my current relationships, am I in a sort of simple collaboration? Some clients may not even be there yet. Or am I in a high-performing enterprise? Or should I aim to be? You know, what are the challenges in me getting there? How difficult would it be? Is it even feasible, recognising that there will be, you know, constraints around me? Again, we heard some of those earlier from Ian in terms of his reference to, you know, the types of restrictions that you have being in the public sector. So that really sets out, I would encourage you to have a look at it. It really sets out, probably in more detail than I'm going to be able to cover, what would come under each heading. But broadly speaking, you've got things under there around what would your governance need to look like. Actually, how do you align that? What does your organisation need to look like? How do you position yourselves with your supply chain? How do you manage integration, particularly key to the supply chain, and actually thinking about what might be the difference, you know, in role of a tier 1 contractor going forward if they're being asked to do more of an integrator role to bring an extended supply chain to engage as part of an enterprise rather than just manage and have complete control over that and complete sort of cash flow control. So it's quite fundamentally different for them as well. It also covers off digital transformation. And then finally, what the role of the owner is. So, you know, I touched on that earlier, but it's a bit about making sure that you've got a strong enough owner who can really drive this through, because without that sort of fundamental change in behaviours, fundamental change in leadership and committed leadership from all of those who come into an alliance and a partnership, it won't change. So there's really quite a lot of sort of stark messages in there if you want to feel the need to go and share those and start to instigate some change around yourselves. That's probably the best tool that you will have from the website to do it. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to cover off, I said on the website there's an awful lot of stuff, if you use that as your sort of signpost, but there's an awful lot of detail that you can delve into around behaviours, around various things. One thing I would point you to would be the commercial handbook. So I know we're here at a contracting procurement conference, but actually there's an awful lot that I think and that the clients recognise that they need to be doing around that, so that when you get to that phase, it's not just all on there was a failure in procurement or we need to demonstrate value just in that process, just in the types of contracts, and that's where you end up with that adversarial relationship. So what we've done, specifically created a commercial handbook that talks a lot more about all of the stuff that you need to do around it to create the right commercial environment, so that you aren't going into procurement as adversaries, you aren't going into a contract already looking at how you are going to be claiming things back and trying to manipulate the system and create perverse behaviours and incentives as a result of that. So what I just picked out here are the sort of headline 6 commercial principles. And essentially, we're not being prescriptive about how you do these, but it's about saying if you get these in place, you're going to be creating the right sort of commercial environment should you wish to then move into a sort of full-scale alliance, a really sort of integrated delivery model, however you design that through your procurement and your contracting. So again, most of these I think probably are common sense to most of you in the room, but it was the first time we'd actually got some consensus with the clients, we'd actually got some consensus with the university and the research they'd done behind it to say, these are the things that we should be at least as a minimum putting in place. So, alignment, so many of the procurements actually would be focused, and because that's what the clients asked for, but actually very much on something, demonstrating value in the short term, whereas we need to shift that much more to rewarding alignment with customer outcomes. I think there's a little bit in there around reward to value added. So there is a lot of discussion about this at the moment with digital transformation. If you think what that might do to the consulting industry, actually how do you reward value added rather than number of hours spent? And what does that do if you switch to that model and shift the change in emphasis, shift the way that people are likely to engage and input to an enterprise if you're doing that rather than paying them on the amount of time they spend quibbling or arguing or redesigning something. Risk, this was a big one, and we are pushing very hard on this one, but it's about making sure that we don't try to transfer that out to the supply chain. It's not saying that the supply chain don't have a role in it, but it's about making that role around incentivizing them to mitigate the risks rather than transferring something out that they can't take on. You pay for anyway, and then it comes back in-house and you pay for twice. The engagement one is a critical one because it's basically early contractor involvement, but it's that at a level where you are talking about outcomes before you even get near building something or deciding you're going to build something or designing it in detail. It's talking about these are the outcomes we want. And if you think of that in the concept of something like a digital railway, it might be that you don't build anything, actually, but you need to get the right people or the right partners involved to help you make those decisions early on in the project lifecycle. Scale, I've mentioned, which is looking at, not just bringing you in to do a very specific transactional task on a program, actually selecting the right partners to work with you at scale and start to look at not just the capital, but also the revenue sides of how you manage and operate your assets. And then finally, having that longer term relationship. Again, it was interesting, and I think it will be an interesting ongoing case study that Ian's got about how that evolves and how those, what look like good relationships at the start, continue to develop and hopefully continue to deliver value over the long term. But the idea is you're not just doing this and you're not just tendering every year or every 2 years and buying in specific bits of expertise, specific bits of the supply chain. You are trying to create a longer term relationship where you can really get to know each other and develop the skills and the relationships together in one alliance. Right, I will now hand over to Emma, who's going to do a little bit on contracts for you.
With the very same issues, and so delighted to share some of the Project 13 thinking with you now in this industry reform, in this movement to a new way of delivering infrastructure. And actually I'll start just by going back one to the slide that Hannah was talking through just now, because Hannah's set out the structure of Project 13 and the work that's been undertaken to date, and then it's closed with these 6 key commercial principles, and this is the target of how we drive this new delivery model. So I'll now talk in practical terms how we create that right commercial environment, how we bring those principles to life through contracts and through a programme from Embedded Change. And if I may, I'm going to steal a term that Linda used just now, which I thought was lovely. This contract for empathy, a contract for society, and a contract that works for all stakeholders. And so as I present these 2 contract structures to you, I hope that Linda will agree that that's exactly what these are intended to do. So the first type of contract, it's an alliance contract. We can see that we have, and this is Project 13 terminology that we hope industry becomes more familiar with now, but we have owner, suppliers, advisor and integrator, all collectively together in one contract structure. And so what does that mean for us as an NEC user community? Well, I think, and I hope it's a good segue for Ian, who will talk later about the actual NEC Alliance contract itself, which is being launched today, of course. And this means all parties in one alliance contract. It probably looks something like a defined cost plus fee, so not a million miles away from an option E. And it's a great example of how these alliance contracts and structures would work in line with this new delivery model. So moving on to the second type of contract. So here you can see we have program incentives. So this is not just one contract as in the previous example, this is multiple contracts. So the owner has separate contracts, for example, with suppliers and with advisor and integrator, but these are brought together under one umbrella of overarching commercial principles. So you essentially have one profit pot that is linked across each of these contracts. And thinking back again to the 6 commercial principles that Hannah outlined, this is able to then draw together that alignment and that joint shared risk and reward. And we're happy to sort of debate what we think about these contract structures in the panel Q&A later. So, actually, before I move off this, one point for the NEC community, I would say, I think multi-party collaboration clause is probably quite a useful indicator and enabler to realising this particular contract structure. Okay, so let's move on now to talk about some do's and don'ts. So these are really just some simple procurement and contracting best practice. So key principles and clauses, so contract structure should be there. It's got to support the enterprise. It's got to bridge that gap between suppliers, advisors, owner and integrator. It's got to be doing its job in achieving that outcome. A sort of mini warning that attention should be paid to the length of tenders and the use of pre-qual. So looking at a strategy across the enterprise to minimise that burden so we can put time and effort and resources into the areas that are really adding the value. And then, of course, something which is very close to my heart, detailed drafting of contracts should focus on unamended versions and minimising, obviously in our case, the use of Z clauses, which can potentially sort of, unravel the spirit of the contract and undermine the commercial strategy that sits behind it. Okay, so moving away now from contracts and talking about what does the Project 13 programme look like in terms of embedding this in industry and driving this change. So we say implement it here, we do mean implement it, but moreover we mean embed it and sort of get this just in the way we think about how we deliver. So four sections of this, resources, and I want to highlight and make really clear that this is available for all, so please do engage with it and use these resources as you can. Hannah's already talked about the handbook and the Project 13 blueprint and the matrix, these are all available, and we'll move on in a little while to talk about the roadmap and the guidance that goes with it. There is support available, advice from peers, so IGC buddies and accredited advisors. I think these are split into 3 layers now, and there'll also in the future be training courses and access to this Project 13 community, which has already gained enormous momentum through the design phase and now through implementation phase. We have 4 early adopters, which I'll talk about. A 5th is just on the brink of signing. So 4 early adopters that are applying the Project 13 principles, sharing their experiences between them and refining the approach as we move through. And then finally, embedding. So there is a large change programme at play in the background. Programme to embed the challenge and systematic blockers will be addressed through business cases, regulatory agreements, the procurement approach and contracts. The roadmap, this is available to look at on the website. You see the website address is written there if you wanted to make a note. And we would encourage you to use this and to understand how to get more collaboration in your projects, programmes and the challenges that organisations face. So I think you can see here, if you sort of work your way through the roadmap, you're able to click on various elements of it and it'll give you pointers and indicators and tips and advice on what you can do to get collaboration really working on your projects and programmes. Okay, so let's now move to who are these early adopters. Well, we've got 4 that we can disclose at the moment. The first is Anglian Water, and we've put Capital Delivery Alliances. This is specifically around their strategic projects. So they've got a sort of new, very complex portfolio of assets and thinking about how that needs to be addressed for the WRMP over a 15 and 20-year cycle. Environment Agency, Next Generation Supplier Arrangements, Heathrow's expansion, and National Grid and their London Power Tunnels 2 project. So that was a canter through contracts and how we are embedding. And then a plea from me, please do get involved, please do engage with this. This is not another one of these industry initiatives where we sort of see it and then it gets put on a shelf and you don't hear it. Project 13, as Hannah outlined, it's very much already out there. There is a community that is engaged with it. It's not just targeted at one layer of the supply chain, it's very much about clients driving this change. And we want more engagement, and please do use our hashtag, which I think is on the hashtag join Project 13, and look forward to debate on this panel. Thank you.